So today I want to talk about Segovia's edition of Sor studies. We're going to start with the very first one, study number 1. This is also known as opus 6 number 8. Originally it was published in the opus 6 studies. So this is also opus 6 number 8. And it makes a lot of sense to me that Segovia would choose this piece as the start of the collection. It is a typical example of good counterpoint on the guitar. It's 3 voices throughout, just like a string trio. I think Segovia was so influenced by great composers, and he wanted to include pieces that really had a style similar to great composers. So this piece is very much like a Haydn string trio or a Mozart string trio. And it requires the student not only to physically be able to play chords very well, but the student also has to begin to understand through this piece how classical music is typically written. And the classical music in general, one of the major characteristics is it's written with the idea that the notes are separate, like a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass choir. In this case, we only have soprano, alto, and bass, like a trio, like I said. But when you're playing this music, it's very important to understand how the notes move independently of one another. So, like in this piece, we have the bass voice moving while the top voice stays the same. And then there's a change. And to most people, that looks like a big chord change. Because physically on the guitar, I have to move to the 3rd position. But in reality, if you look at what's happening here, and this is what I mean, if you look at what's happening, we have C and E on top, C and E on top, and then C and D, which the C resolves to the B. So really the movement, although physically, we do make a large change in the guitar, and visually it can look like it's a large change. In reality, we have very tight voice leading throughout this whole piece. And I believe that Segovia, not only did he want people to work on chords, but I think he also thought it would be a good idea for students, and certainly with my students, this is what I emphasize, it's a good idea to study the piece as music, to really understand how the notes are moving and how they resolve and how they influence the other notes around them. Okay, so we start off, like I said, with this bass note moving up, and then we have a suspension resolution. Then we push up in the top while the bass moves down. Another suspension resolution over A minor. Now we start to have movement in both voices. Bass, top, bass, top, bass, top. They all come together here, and we reach the first large cadence. Now, I like to point out to the students what's happening here. As we can see, this is from the end of the 4th measure, first line, 4th measure. I'm working from the Segovia edition, so I will call out the measures according to lines and number of measures. So we're on the first line, 4th measure. At the end of the 4th measure, he starts this counterpoint. The bass goes down, the top goes up. Okay? Now, the top goes down, the bass goes up. Bass goes down again, the top goes up, and it keeps going back and forth. Bass goes down, top goes up, down, up. You can hear how that works. I'll play it the whole thing, so you can hear how it just goes up and down on each voice. It's very nice. Okay, now right there at that G cadence in the original, in the Opus 6 number 8 version, it's G, G, and B natural. So if you're working from the Segovia edition has a G octave, but the original is with a third over it, a G, G, and B on top. So that's what I'm playing. All right, so that's a really interesting part. And in terms of physicality, this is usually the most difficult part for people to play. And what I would recommend is, first of all, make sure that your hand is nice and close so you can reach your bass notes easily. Make sure your fingers are curled up on top. Not this. You can see how this is going to be a problem because the strings are going to want to pull down as your wrist comes out. So make sure your wrist is close. And then prepare your fingers. Notice my second finger getting ready, right? Then getting ready. Notice 3 and 4 are ready here for this chord. Notice 1, 2, and 3 now move into place. 4 gets ready. 3 and 2 are now ready. For a lot of people, this is a very difficult little section, getting ready. So every time you move to a place, make sure you're getting ready for the next chord. Getting ready. And just do it slow a few times and make sure your movement is nice and smooth. You don't want to be like moving abrasively into these chords. It makes it much more difficult. You just want to move nice and gentle, nice and smooth. Okay, now we move on. Bass moves. And what do we have? We have imitation in the top. Middle voice moves up a little bit. Very nice. Now we have imitation on top, which gets imitated by the bass. Again, top, bass. Imitation, C, D, E in the bass. Notice the top, C, D, E, D, E, F, D, E, F. Prepare your fingers like we did before. Cadence. Okay, I want to take that spot and discuss what's happening in the counterpoint and in the technique. So this is the 4th line, 3rd measure. And what's happening here is we have the bass starting like a cello, starting a melody, and then it's taken over by the violin and viola. That's sort of what's happening. And it's exactly the same notes in separate octaves. C, D, E, C, E. Listen to the top now. Does E, F, A, which is different than the bass. The bass did this. So you would expect he's going to do this, but he doesn't. He gives you A to indicate the end of the phrase. It's also a very expressive note. Now we move on. So we move on, and now we have scales in the top. Notice the scale, the melody in the top is all scales. It goes up 3 notes, then drops a 4th. 3 notes, drops a 4th. E, F sharp, G, D, C, F, C, D, E. It keeps doing that. Another little cadence. Okay? Now, another thing that's really nice about this, for those that know theory, this is a circle of 5th progression, and it's got a lot of subdominant movement, but that's not so important. What I like to emphasize to my students is the fact that the middle voice here is a chromatic scale. Often we learn chromatic scales like this in the beginning stages of playing to get get the hand position correct. Well, this is an example of chromatic scale work in the middle voice here, in the viola voice, if you want to consider it that. So we're working from now, this is the fifth line, fourth measure. We start with the C octaves. Then we have, in the middle voice, C, B, B flat, A. So it's really beautiful. I mean, and this is something I'll tell my students to do, is sing that voice, really bring it out if you can. It just really clarifies what's happening in the construction, and it gets your ear more and more clear about what you're playing, which is vitally important in playing this kind of music. Now we move on. After this cadence, notice what happens is the bass now takes the melody. It does exactly the same notes, but in the bass. So we have E, F sharp, G. Same writing, it's just that it's flipped, it's inverted. The bass now has the melody. Notice that the middle voice is still a chromatic scale, and on top he has the suspensions, like a violin would suspend over the harmonies. So in the last phrase, after this, he ends up in C major. Then he gives you this really sort of oily chord. The middle voice and the top interact. One of the few times in the piece where that actually happens. Really beautiful writing. The ending section, at least in the Segovia edition, I would say, from the last three lines of music, what makes it difficult is holding the notes for the full value. You have to be very careful that you don't let go of notes. For instance, toward the end here, very often people do this. And they let go because it's convenient to let go of the top. But the top has to be held, just like a violin. Too, the middle voice. Hold them as long as you can. It's really a wonderful study. So as you can see, this is not a particularly virtuosic piece of music. This is not about how do I move my fingers fast. This piece is really about understanding construction, understanding how notes move and interact on the guitar in the classical style. You could take this piece apart and give it to a string trio and it would sound wonderful, and I'm sure people have already done that. And so the point of this piece, and I think the point of Segovia starting with this piece, is to get people not only interested in how do I move my fingers, but to really develop a love for the style of classical music, the tradition of the classical music composer, and the composition of classical music. And so as you're studying it, try not to just think of it as, okay, my fingers go here, my fingers go there. Really try to emphasize looking at the notes and understanding what's going on in the notes. This will serve you so well in the future as you move on to any other piece in the classical repertoire. Even pieces that don't have a lot of counterpoint and voice leading, they will have some. And so the sooner you get used to looking for the way the lines move, the easier things will get, the faster your understanding, the faster you learn, and the faster you memorize, and the less you will forget. So for me, this is a very important lesson, far more important in many ways than just learning how to play fast. Playing fast is fine, but something like this has a much deeper lesson in terms of classical music understanding. And so I hope you'll consider that as you're studying it.